Commissioners' work session to order, and I want to thank everybody for coming out on this almost to be gloomy next couple of days. We're going to start by reviewing our minutes, and I will ask for an approval of the minutes to get it on the floor because there is going to be a little bit of discussion. So do I hear a motion to move approval of the minutes?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, now I'm going to open the floor for discussion and call on Commissioner Hartley.
Thank you so much. This is not a big deal. I think I was not clear at the last work session, so I just wanted to clarify what I was asking for. So looking at the fourth paragraph, going over into the second page, I think this is not what I was trying to say. We have Commissioner Hartley also said it would be helpful for the community to have a schedule to see all tenant uses, and asked Director Womack if she could do that, including soccer events. Just to clarify what I think I said and what I'm looking for, I would like to get a grid that shows the existing uses of the facility today, the actual and potential uses today of the facility, and a comparison to the planned uses under the Bristol agreement and the maximum number of uses under the Bristol agreement. Does that make sense? Okay. So I don't actually care if we revise the minutes. I just want to make sure we actually get that information. So I will withdraw any problem with the minutes. I just wanted to put that out.
Actually, I think just for the record, we should go ahead and amend the minutes to include that. So can I hear a motion to amend the minutes? And that would be for you.
So moved.
And second.
Okay. Is there a second to amend the minutes?
Second.
Okay. Do I hear a motion to move approval or a vote to move approval of the minutes as amended?
So moved.
No, I'm going to go one at a time. I'm going to go this way this time. Commissioner Avila.
So moved.
Commissioner Hendricks.
Aye.
Commissioner Hartley.
Aye.
And I am an aye as well. So the minutes as amended pass, and I am now going to read the legal notice so that we can go into the bulk of the meeting today. Is information for our audience: if you're not satisfied with the decision made by the Metro Board of Fair Commissioners today, you may appeal the decision by petitioning for a writ of cert with the Davidson County Chancery or Circuit Court. Your appeal must be filed within 60 days of the date of entry of the board's decision. To ensure that your appeal is filed in a timely manner and that all procedural requirements have been met, please be advised that you should contact your own independent legal counsel. I'm going to reverse a little bit of the order and slide item B to item 1. So we will first hear the presentation of the financial review regarding the Nashville Fairgrounds Speedway renovation, and our representative is Jay Leonard, and he will be presenting to us by Zoom.
Hi, Jay.
Hello. Madam Chair?
Yes.
This is Tom. I think it might be a little more understandable for the board for me to give a little bit of background, and then Jay maybe can hit the highlights in his report. But I think the background is sort of helpful to sort of understand what we asked him to do.
That'll be great.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to open the floor for Mr. Cross at this point.
Thank you. This is sort of related to the development agreement, and I'm going to refer to that. When Bristol we initiated discussions about this project, of course, one of the things that Metro is interested in are what the revenues are likely to be that we can use to support the bonds. And among the revenues that they're projected are some that are, fixed like rent, and there are some that are variable like the sales tax redirect that are dependent on activation of the facility. Well, the the reasonable thing for somebody in Metro's position to do is to get somebody else to help verify the projections that have been made, which is what we engaged Mr. Leonard to do. And Mr. Leonard, and could do a better job introducing himself than I can, but he's with CSL, which is a internationally recognized firm that works on entertainment, conventions, sports facilities, and is sort of an expert on projecting revenues as we're talking about today. So Mr. Leonard provided a report to Metro in, I think, January of 2022. I think that all the Fair Board members have been provided a copy of it, and I don't know that you have it in front of you at the moment, but at the end of the report is a summary of the revenues that we're talking about, including both the fixed and variable revenues. It's on page 38 of the report if you happen to have it with you, and it's an Excel chart that looks like this. I know you can't see it from where you are. So Mr. Leonard concluded that in many areas the projections that Bristol had made were reasonable. In a few others, he took a more conservative approach. His conclusions are summarized in this table, and for some of these variable categories, they're a little lower than what Bristol had provided to us. We are going to use Mr. Leonard's conclusions in connection with determining what the level of our commitment is for the bonds. And that is in part of Exhibit H to the development agreement. So where he has projected specific amounts for what we can expect for our 5% gross revenue share, our food and beverage share, advertising and sponsorship revenue, we have taken his projections and put them directly into a pro forma, a version of which is going to go into the development agreement, is going to be the basis for the determination of what the maximum bonding we can afford will be. So I'm not sure that I have given a good summary of this, and Jay, please correct me if I have misstated how you went about your work, but that's what we have done. We would like for Bristol's projections to turn out to be correct, or maybe we'll do even better, but we've tried to make sure that we've got a set of numbers that we feel confident about for bonding. Jay?
Hear me okay? Good. Okay. Well, thanks for that overview. Yes, I'm Jay Linhart, Senior Vice President with a company called CSL, and we were brought in late 2021 to really evaluate the proposed financing plan. You know, I think it was mentioned, I think about a third of the revenues dedicated to pay back debt service are scheduled payments that are based on rents from either Bristol or CVC, and then the remaining 2/3 are fluctuating or dependent upon the ability to drive event activity through the Fairground Speedway and secure sponsorships and so forth. And so the vast majority of kind of our due diligence and vetting of the financial projections from Bristol were really related to the fluctuating revenues. And so some of those include sponsorships, which was a revenue stream. I think it's roughly about the first 600,000 in sponsorship revenues are dedicated to debt service. You know, from our perspective, we evaluated sponsorship revenues generated in comparable speedways across the country. We looked at the corporate market in Nashville and the larger metro region, and feel that number is very conservative, that the Bristol will generate revenues that are well in excess of that minimum amount. So we feel very confident in that number. The rest of the numbers all depend on really the event activity and the level of attendance that's drawn to the speedway, whether that be the ticket tax, the sales tax, or the gross revenue tax. And so we spent a fair amount of time in our report doing some due diligence around those numbers. And so we worked with Bristol Motor Speedway to get historical attendance and track activity at 4 comparable tracks across the country, including Texas Motor Speedway, Las Vegas Motor Speedway, Bristol Motor Speedway, and Charlotte Motor Speedway, which among all the tracks in the country were the most similar in terms of market and kind of business operational goals related to their speedways. So what we did in the absence of maybe a broader market study where you might engage prospective fans and corporate sponsors to assess their interest is we conducted what we call a penetration analysis. And so we looked at the historical attendance at other tracks and the population in each of those markets, and really came down to a metric of the population per attendee in each market, and then related that back to Nashville and the local market demographics in terms of, for local racing and regional racing and local events, it's either the CBSA or we'll call it a 100-mile ring around the facility. And then for major racing events, it's much more of a regional draw. So we looked at about a 250-mile ring in terms of a capture area. And long story short in that analysis, the key major racing events, whether that be cup races, Xfinity races, or truck races, we felt that Bristol's assumptions were reasonable. And then I think some of the local and regional racing and some of the other events were mostly reasonable. Some we felt were high. And so as was mentioned before, we took a more conservative approach and reduced some of those attendance projections, which I think on the surface, we were about 25% lower as a frame of magnitude in terms of our revenue projections on an overall basis based on that analysis. And then that analysis was used to, I think, negotiate finer deal points and is used in the debt service repayment schedules that are currently available. So that's kind of a high-level overview. I'd be happy to answer any questions about our due diligence and the process that we went through to evaluate the financial projections.
Thank you so much, Mr. Leonard. Do I have any commissioners that want to engage him with any questions at this point? Commissioner Hartley.
Thank you. And it's Mr. Leonard?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And this was a very, very helpful report. Thank you for going through it with us. I'm going to confess, I did not know we were hearing from Mr. Leonard tonight. So I did. The one thing I forgot to reread was the CSL report, having read all the other documents. So this is a little bit off the cuff, but just a couple of questions.
Sure.
First, I think this first question is actually for, I'm going to try to put these in order, sorry. Okay, I think I'll just go this way. Reading this, if I can refresh my recollection of this report, Mr. Leonard, you've got some categories that you found Bristol's projections to be reasonable, some that you thought they potentially overestimated the potential revenue, and I think a few they may have underestimated. The upshot of all that, when I look at page 37 of your report, I see that the upshot or the line in here that I want to ask you about, it says, based on these projections, it's likely that Metro will exhaust its debt service reserve funds and require the use of general funds to meet its financial obligations. Do I understand that to mean that based on your projections, you think that the debt service fund will be depleted, or based on Bristol's projections? And what I'm trying to get at is, I'm trying to figure out if we're using CSL's numbers to figure out how much we're borrowing, I want to make sure that CSL's estimate does not still leave us in the hole $6.5 million.
I believe, and I'll defer to Tom, but since our report was completed in May, there's been additional negotiations. There's additional upfront money, I think, from the CVB or CVC and some restructured scheduled payments. So I think the report that you're looking at from CSL in May, the debt service number is lower now.
Okay, so just as a follow-up, and then I'll follow up, and then Tom, please jump in. So I think I understand that this report is generated based on the structure of the deal from, say, 9 to 12 months ago, after which we've obviously, the city has done a great job negotiating a more favorable position with Bristol. And so what you're saying is, it sounds like what you're saying is based on your projections in this report from a year ago, there was a $6.5 million gap, but potentially based on the additional negotiation between the city and Bristol, that gap may have been closed?
Correct. And then I think the other key takeaway is the fluctuating revenues. So in the debt schedule, there's some fixed payments from rents and then fluctuating revenues. I understand that the current numbers use all CSL fluctuating revenue projections. So that whole methodology I just described, we're coming in roughly 25% below Bristol in terms of events and attendance. That they're using those numbers. I think the only difference is between the report and today, it was agreed upon, I believe, that there's a $5 or 10% ticket tax, whichever is less. And I believe in our initial report, we were assuming $4 versus 10% the first 15 years. So I think there's some added revenue from the ticket tax over the CSL report, but it's the same methodology.
Have you, Mr. Leonard, have you looked at I think you're right about that. And I think there's some other additional, beneficial provisions from the city's point of view in the new deal. Have you looked at the updated lease and development agreement and had a chance to think about how the updated terms would impact your findings?
I've had the opportunity to look at the updated bond amortization schedule. Is that your question?
Well, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is since you're our expert to determine whether the revenues will be sufficient to cover the debt service, have you looked at the most current version of the deal to determine what the payments from Bristol are, to determine whether those payments will be sufficient to cover the debt service? I know obviously the methodology that defines the variable provisions may be the same, but there's also some fixed payments that have gone up, some other things in the deal have changed. I'm just asking if you've looked at the updated documents.
Yes, I've looked at the updated numbers, and I'm comfortable in the context of our due diligence, the report we issued in May, and where the numbers sit today.
Okay, so last question on this line, and I apologize. I should have mentioned, Mr. Leonard, that I'm a recovering trial lawyer / attorney, so hopefully I'm not questioning too pointedly. But what I'm hearing you say is you've looked at the updated deal. Based on the revenue streams flowing from Bristol to the city in the updated deal, you feel confident that the revenue streams are sufficient to cover the debt service because the ratios that are used in the debt service for the bond issuance are in line or are still enough to cover what we're borrowing.
Are you asking if the 1.2 debt coverage ratio that's in the amortization table is sufficient?
Yeah, well, sorry, and I apologize. I'm not a financial professional. So what I'm trying to ask is, will enough money come in under the current structure of the deal to cover the debt service ratio based on your analysis?
I believe so. In a normalized year, obviously, when you have special years like a COVID where no events take place, those would be the exception. But generally speaking, we fully expect that the revenues generated in any given year will exceed the debt service payment based on the current structure. Okay,
thank you. And Tom, obviously you've been in the deal and you reacted to this to redo the deal. So can you kind of fill us in on, your point of view on, does the sort of more favorable position the city's reached since this report was issued, does that solve that sort of hole that we see, that $6.5 million that was in the initial report?
Yes. The point of the exercise was to make sure we knew where to size our commitment. And one of the terms that was used there, this debt service ratio or coverage ratio, the idea is, and we couldn't actually issue bonds if the revenues exactly matched the debt service payment. You have to have a little extra. So one of the notes in Mr. Lenhart's report had to do with a recommendation that we use a 1.5 ratio. But Metro is going to be backstopping these bonds, and so we think we can issue with a ratio of 1.2. And that's what the amortization schedule shows, that if you add up all of the columns in each of the years, what the revenue projections are, both fixed and variable, there's 1.2 times what's necessary to cover the debt.
Thank you.
It might be helpful to also talk about the debt service reserve fund and how much is being funded up front to for a rainy day.
Yeah, so related, we will have a debt service reserve fund, which will be sufficient to cover the maximum debt service in any year of the lease term. And we will talk a little bit about the waterfall when we get to the part where we're talking about the lease specifically. One of the levels in the waterfall is replenishing that debt service reserve. The first layer is pay the bond debt. The second place where revenues go after that's been done, to the extent that there's excess, is to go to the debt service reserve fund.
Sherry, I have some additional questions, but I'd love to defer if anyone else has some questions right now for Mr. Leonard, and I can come back around.
Any of the other commissioners have a question at this point?
I did want to just ask if there was an updated sheet that we can take a look at so that we can see that there will be no debt that we will incur. Like to be told, oh, we think, or there's a possibility. We know that there are all possibilities that anything could happen. However, I mean, the report that we have currently shows that there's a huge debt that's possible. And if you've taken a look at it, can we at least, see how the math?
Yes, we can give you the pro forma. It's likely to change because interest rates are changing, and that affects what the debt service is likely to be. But we'll get you what we provided to Mr. Lenhart for you to look at too. And it shows in each column exactly, for the variable columns, it shows exactly what's in his report, with the exception of the ticket tax column, which, as he mentioned, the plan now is to use the maximum that the statute permits rather than a lower number, which had been used previously.
So, Tom, let me just clarify. Page 38 in the CSL report, what you're going to provide us is going to be similar to that, but with corrected numbers.
Yes.
That would be helpful. Thank you. Commissioner Hartley?
I have more questions.
Go ahead. No, he's done. Go ahead.
Mr. Leonard, when there's a section in your report titled Risk Factors, would you mind just summarizing your 1, 2, 3, and 4 risk factors for us so we can understand? Obviously, the deal, again, has changed, and I keep looking at Tom because he's clearly beaten Bristol up and gotten a better deal, but we want to at least look at those risk factors and see, what the risks are in the deal. Could you kind of give us a nutshell of each of those risk factors? And I'm looking at page 40 of your report.
Sounds a little troubling. Were you asking me to run through the risk factors in the report?
Yes.
Okay. I think the first one has been mentioned on page 40 about the coverage ratios, and really we would defer to bond counsel based on where they're comfortable. We had recommended that you definitely consider some type of coverage ratio because, we have a lot of experience over 30 years of projecting revenues, but obviously there's going to be natural ebbs and flows depending on unforeseen circumstances, whether that's something like a COVID pandemic or a rain out or race or something like that. So certainly having coverage ratios helps with risk mitigation. The level of those ratios depend on how the bonds are structured and any kind of back payment or backup payment to those bonds and the pledged revenues. And so ultimately that would be determined by the bond counsel. Some of the other risk factors are, it's a 30-year agreement. But
Mr. Leonard, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
NASCAR racing works is they don't make 30-year commitments to entities like Bristol to award them races. They're on a much shorter term, several-year term. So, you look at the history of NASCAR racing and they've continued to maintain and grow the number of races that they have under their control and where they can allocate them among the tracks that they operate. But that is, something to point out, that you're entering a 30-year agreement and there's not a 30-year guarantee of, hosting those races each and every year within the market. Now, they're also incentivized to drive as much revenue through that facility as possible. From a financing standpoint, it generates tax revenues and sponsorships to help pay the debt, but it also generates revenue for them to help pay their operating expenses and provide a return on their investment. Yep.
I have another question.
Okay.
And I'm
sorry, I can't see anybody.
Well, and really, I just wanted to I like to say back to you what you said, because you're an expert and much smarter than I am. I just want to make sure I'm following you. So for the first one, your risk factor was essentially what you're saying to Metro is, don't just make sure there's just enough money to cover the debt service based on the money that's coming in. We should have a cushion, and that's sort of when Tom was talking about the 1.5 times versus 1.2 times. Is that correct? Is that how we should understand that?
That's correct. That's
Okay.
correct. As I mentioned, that the lending agencies will figure out what that appropriate coverage is, and they'll look at those revenue streams. So remember, a third of the revenue streams are contractually rent payments that have nothing to do. Like if they don't book one event and draw one attendee to the Speedway, a third of the debt payment is coming from guaranteed payments from Bristol and from the CVC. Then they look at the 2/3, and some of the 2/3, for example, is coming from sponsorship revenues, where Bristol needs to go out and do, call it 4 to 6 major founding sponsors for the Speedway that will generate more than sufficient revenues to cover their guaranteed minimum on sponsorships. I would look at that revenue stream as pretty solid. Then you kind of go down the list, and the rest of it is based on events and attendance and ticket taxes and sales taxes, et cetera. That's where some of the variability comes in, and that's where our due diligence was key in understanding, what's an appropriate assumption as you go into your financial plan, and that's where we've actually reduced some of those assumptions and revenues to help reduce the risk to Metro that those revenues might not be met. And I think we were down roughly around 25% or so in all those different categories. And so those all play into ultimately what's that comfort level, what's that cushion, debt coverage ratio that's appropriate for a project like that.
Thank you. And you already hit the second risk factor, which I would summarize back as the deal doesn't require Bristol to provide any race. They obviously use best efforts, and then their interests are aligned with the city's interests to provide a race. But your point is those races are provided on like a 1 year or two, a couple years out. So there's no guarantee that there'll be a NASCAR race in Bristol's portfolio to put in the Speedway necessarily. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Great. And then I think you hadn't hit your third one yet, but just in the interest of time, I would characterize that as you don't know what local conditions in the market could do to the sort of quality of the events. There might be competition among multiple racetracks or entertainment dollars. Is that sort of a fair summary of what you're saying there?
Correct.
Great. And then the fourth, obviously, is that some events, it's an outside facility, so some events, some of those variable income streams like F&B and tickets would depend on rainouts. Is that fair?
Correct.
Commissioner, do you have any other questions?
Just looking to my notes real quick. Give me 1 second.
Sure.
Sorry. Mr. Leonard, what data sources did you use to sort of estimate some of especially the variable expense lines? The reason I ask is, you guys probably all got, the Fair Board all got information from community members. One question was sort of how are we calculating the value or the potential revenue impact of local racing? We had obviously a community input session recently, and protecting local racing was a very important thing that I heard from a lot of the communities, that we want to protect local racing. And so I'm trying to figure out, where did you get the information to determine the revenue generating possibility of that? And the reason is, I'm trying to figure out within this deal whether local racing is something that will continue happening at the fairgrounds. And so I'm trying to figure out, we're seeing revenue projections for local racing, and I just want to know where the data that supported those projections came from.
That's a great question. And so it's a combination of factors. And so we looked at local racing historical performance at the four speedways that I mentioned across the country to look at the history that they've had there. We work closely with the fairground management to understand historical racing at the fairgrounds, recognizing, I think, candidly, the promoter stability in the past has been an issue. And so I think as we look forward, we looked at the historical data there, we looked across the country, and then we looked at Bristol Motor Speedway's projections and understanding that we're going to significantly enhance this venue and the marketing acumen that Bristol would bring to the table versus maybe what some of the past promoters have brought to the table, and their relationship at that track will be significantly better. All of that factored into our projections for local racing. We carry local racing through the financial projections. We were not quite as bullish as Bristol was, but we certainly think that it can do much better than it has done historically, given improvements to the track and better marketing.
So essentially, if we build it, they will come on a conservative estimation.
If you build it and you market it correctly and you provide a great experience and it's priced right, yes.
One follow-up, Mr. Leonard, did you consider in your analysis of Bristol's revenue streams, nothing that I see in this deal requires Bristol to hold any certain type of event. So to Anthony's point, if they build it, we will come. Is it, and again, this is kind of a qualitative statement. I don't know if you can answer this. We may have to ask someone from Bristol to answer this, but wouldn't it be in Bristol's interest to hold a higher value event in lieu of a local racing event? And the reason I'm asking the question, just for the commissioners, is I believe that we heard from the community that local racing is very important, and I'm trying to make sure that we don't end up in a situation where we've built a Super Bowl and we can't have a minor league game in the Super Bowl.
Right.
Mr. Cooper, do you want to speak to that? Jay, I'm going to let Mr. Cooper speak to that for a minute.
Well, I think the limitation on the exclusive event weeks, I think that's your big races. That's what Bristol will be targeting for those larger events. The other local racing, they're looking to use their marketing team that they have, which is a very robust marketing team in the racing world, to help promote those local events, but keep them local. Is that right?
Correct.
Jay. Jay, did you have anything else to add? He can't hear me. Can you tell him?
Sorry.
That's okay. Communication error up here. Okay. Any of the other commissioners have any questions here at this point? Okay. Seeing none, we really thank you, Jay, if you can hear me.
You're welcome. Thank you for
Thank you, Jay.
Sherry, and I'm sorry to ask this, but
Sure.
I didn't know we were going through the CSL report today, so I might ask that, if we have a future session where we can read it, we might want to have Mr. Leonard come back and answer some follow-up questions or send him some questions via email. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks, Jay.
Okay, we are now going to move to presentation by Bristol and Metro Legal relative to the community benefits agreement, but we are going to bring Mr. Kuhn up here from Bristol to share with us their plans, and then we'll hear from Metro Legal.
All right.
Matt, hang on just a second for me. Did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that that we will be getting an updated report, right? Those updated numbers, we will receive those. You will. All right.
Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Commissioners. I appreciate the opportunity to come talk about our community partnerships and the approach we've taken. Being a good community partner is the DNA of our company. It's something we do in Bristol, and it's something that we're looking to bring here to Nashville. We wanted to find a way that our presence at the fairgrounds would have a beneficial impact on the surrounding community, As we bring new life to this old speedway, we also believe it's our responsibility to include being a good neighbor and make a positive contribution to the communities around us through these strong community partnerships. Our goal with these partnerships is to support established local organizations who are addressing real community needs and providing meaningful benefits to Nashville. There are numerous organizations across the city that do this, obviously, so we narrowed our focus by looking at organizations in close proximity to the Speedway who are serving specific populations, students, veterans, and families. It's obviously natural, and I've gotten the question of why we can't commit to the same thing that the Nashville Soccer Holdings committed to in their community benefits agreement. And the answer to that is simply the scale and impact of our proposal. I've got great admiration for the work that Nashville Soccer Club and the other stakeholders are doing with that, namely using their mixed-use development to bring in affordable housing and a child care center that are much needed in this area. Simply, our project is not at the same scale, and so our best path to creating real impact for us was these partnerships with established local community organizations. Last December, we held an event at Operation Stand Down to unveil our community partnerships and our commitments. And I'm grateful that at least 3 representatives from those organizations are here today, and I just wanted to introduce them real quick. First, from Glencliff High School, the academy coach there at Glencliff, Ms. Tommy Kelly. Then we're also joined by the CEO of Operation Stand Down Tennessee, General Eden Murray, and the co-executive director of Conexión Americas, Martha Silva. Their willingness to attend today means the world to me, means the world to BMS, and I think it's reflective of our mutual commitment to the success of these partnerships going forward. Our commitment is to assist in the great work that they are already doing through the utilization of the resources at our disposal, including staff, facilities, industry relationships, and of course, financial contributions. This work will obviously scale up as Nashville Fairgrounds Speedway comes online, but our efforts have already started. To date, we've been present in classrooms, hosted field trips, sponsored events for teachers and staff, participated in fundraisers, and most recently hosted an event bringing NASCAR driver Daniel Suarez to Casa Azafran for an afternoon with local members of the Boys and Girls Club. And if you haven't seen it already, that event made the cover of Azul 615, a Spanish language newspaper, here this week. So some fun photos of Boys and Girls Club children having a great time. And I promise that this is just the beginning of our efforts to impact Nashville in real and meaningful ways. Just to speak a little bit to what we've done thus far, I've asked Tommy Kelly from Glencliff High School if she'd be willing to share briefly kind of the value of corporate partnerships to them, but also about some of the things that we've already done. She can just take a seat.
Good evening, everybody. I am Tommy Kelly. I serve as the Academy Coach at Glencliff High School. If you're not familiar with the academies in Nashville, it is a great opportunity where business and community partners can get involved with our students and give them real-world opportunities to be college or career ready. We started our partnership with Bristol Motor Speedway about 1.5 years ago, and they came and visited Glencliff, and we talked about ways that we could get them involved and connected. And the one thing that stood out to me from that meeting was they never came and they never said, well, we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to change this, and we're going to change that. They came in to me and to my principals, and they said, what can we do to support the work that you guys are already doing? And sometimes you have big name partners come in and they say, we're going to do this, and we're going to change this pathway, and we're going to give you this opportunity, but they never once did that. Since that summer meeting, they've hit the ground running with their involvement with Glencliff High School. They've attended numerous summer planning days. They've attended many of our advisory board meetings. They've hosted field trips, job shadows, and guest speaking, and have been active members of our school's advisory board and our school community. We're grateful for the opportunity that this gives our students to be successful post-secondary, and we look forward to what our relationship will look like as this continues to grow and this continues to come to fruition. But I'm very grateful for the support. Matthew has become a friend. The Bristol Motor Speedway has become family, and we're very thankful at Glencliff High School for their partnership and for the many opportunities that they're giving our students. Thank you.
So, Madam Chair, if I
Thank
may
you.
ask a question, if possible?
Absolutely.
So at our public hearing a few weeks ago, there was a person who stood up and she said that there was concerns from some of the teachers that they are not able to, or it's difficult for them to go over some of the placement exam studies that happens on the weekends if there's a race going on. Have you guys have discussed that, or has that been brought to your attention?
That has not been brought to our attention. We are not in a very close proximity to this area. I mean, we're in 37211. We're just down Nolensville Road, but that has not been brought to my attention at Glencliff High School.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for your time.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thanks to Tommy for doing that. And I'll be really brief in wrapping up here, but I did want to highlight some of the other commitments that are in our document here in addition to those partnerships. So something that you'll hear us talk about a lot is our commitment to Speedway Children's Charities. And we opened a chapter of Speedway Children's Charities in every market that we operate. And that's a foundation that'll donate to local children's organizations in the area. And so just as a point of reference, just recently in Bristol, we distributed nearly $675,000 in grants to 71 different organizations in Bristol and surrounding communities. And we would bring a chapter of Speedway Children's Charities here as well. We've committed to a local minimum wage for all hiring at the Speedway. That is a floor. Obviously, the market is changing, and so that floor might have to change as well. The work with Metro Arts and Beautification, once we have a facility, to work hand in hand with them, create publicly available meeting spaces for community groups, not just our official partners, but anyone who needs this space. This will remain a Metro facility, and so we want to make it available to anybody to use when possible. Also, internships, preference to Nashville area students, fundraising opportunities and support for other local nonprofits, and then diversity and inclusion and hiring commitments. And we're partnering with the North Nashville Community and Economic Development Consortium to help us build out that program. And we're working with them as we speak to flush out an agreement and what that relationship looks like. So that's all I've got. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to have this public forum to speak to this, and I'm happy to introduce you to any of our community partners, or anyone, introduce you to our community partners to learn about the great work that they're already doing.
Do we have any questions from the commissioners? Commissioner Opla?
Yeah, thanks for that report, and thank you for being here, the three representatives. When I looked at, as we were listening to Glencliff, so you have Glencliff and Fall Hamilton. What was the process of choosing those two schools and why?
So Fall Hamilton is in very close proximity to the racetrack, so that was a natural partner to reach out to. Glencliff High School, one of their academy programs includes an automotive and light repair pathway. So that kind of became a natural connection there, in an area that we felt like we could come in and naturally assist. Made a lot of sense.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Commissioner Hendricks?
And I just wanted to follow up with Commissioner's question, which is not just about the schools, but how could you explain this, like the process in coming up with the overall agreement and the committee itself, just for full transparency, because there's a lot of talk about there not being a community benefits agreement, and that things were sort of rushed or put together. So how long was this process, and how did you come up with the partners themselves?
Okay, so about 24 months ago, we started the process of meeting with all of the neighborhood groups and local community groups. That list was put together by a bunch of different people had insight. I know Laura had input into who we needed to meet with locally. The local council person did as well. We expanded that list as we went forward. And from our conversations with local community members, we kind of identified some of these partners were on that initial list, but then we also identified other partners that were impacting the neighborhoods that we met with that would make sense to partner with.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hartley.
Matt, thank you for the overview. And number one, thank you to our partners for being here. My wife's an elementary school teacher here in Nashville. My father's a veteran, and I live right across the street from Casa Azafran. So I feel that you chose some really great organizations. I think no one is going to dispute that, giving back to the community is something that's both important and that is expected, obviously, of Bristol that's coming in. And it sounds like you have a commitment to that. Just a couple of questions. I guess the first question is really more for Metro Legal, and obviously this is not our contract. Metro is not a party to this agreement. I can see that it's between Bristol and the charity. So this isn't as much a question, or maybe you can answer this, maybe you can't, but we're hearing a lot in the community about a community benefits agreement, and we've got a little bit of clarity around language. But what my question is for you guys is, this is really great initiatives, but how enforceable is this in the sense of, is there teeth in this agreement that actually holds Bristol to maintain these commitments through the life of the deal?
Ann.
I've actually not been provided with any documents, so I can't speak to enforceability. Metro would not be a party, and therefore Metro would not be taking any action to enforce it.
Let me just interject. This might be a good time to share what you were going to share in your presentation, in your words. And Tom, I think you may be better placed right now to at least answer that question.
I'm not sure I can approve on the answer that you were given. The community benefits agreements, Metro can't be a party to. And I'm sure that at the risk of stealing some of Ann's thunder, there are some things that we could require just as a party to a contract like a lease. But there are some other things that we're statutorily prevented from requiring. It happens that minimum wage requirements are one of them. That's not to say that they can't have a community benefits agreement with as many community groups as they would like. It's up to those groups to determine what level of contract security they're going to require and enforceability. So this is one of those things that it's good for the board to know about and what efforts they're making to be good neighbors. But we can't be a party. We're not going to be involved in enforcing whatever it is.
Well, Tom, you did steal my thunder. I really don't have too much to add to that. I just, as Tom said, per state law, there are a number of provisions that Metro cannot require, and generally, community benefits agreements tend to involve those kinds of provisions. Not necessarily. There might be some that don't. But generally, Metro is not going to be a party or require there to be one between other parties for those reasons.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And that's the answer I expected. I mean, you can read the document. You can see that Metro is not a party. We wouldn't have any standing to object if, for example, Bristol decided to go a different direction, the economy changed, we decided to go a different way. I don't expect Bristol to do that. I expect Bristol to live up to their commitments here. But I think what's important for us, and the reason I asked the question is this is a good starting document, but there is no real teeth to this document. There's nothing that's holding this together, in my opinion. Obviously, everyone can read it themselves and make that analysis. I think one thing we should consider is, we can't put, for example, a community benefits agreement. We have no role in that as this board. But one thing we can do is, well, actually, I'll ask that question. If we wanted to do things like require minority sourcing participation in this agreement, is that something that we can do? I know you spoke about the minimum wage as another example, but can you speak to that first one? And the reason I ask is obviously Mr. John Cooper, not Mayor John Cooper, Mr. Cooper mentioned that the development agreement is going to be structured and follow Metro's procurement rules. But is there anything that requires the lease and operation of the facility to follow those same rules?
There's nothing in the lease that requires them to follow Metro rules because we don't really have a part of our code that pertains to leases. And the language in the code that pertains to solicitation of construction contracts is very carefully balanced with our constitutional limitations on what we can require. They're fairly aggressive for a municipality, I would say. We can't legally do set-asides or things like that. So most of our construction contracts, for example, have goals in them. And I'm glad to say that in the contracts that the Fair Board has been involved in, the goals have routinely been exceeded. That's not currently a part of the lease.
Thank you. So the comment response to that is I think we should consider going as far as we could in the actual documents that we can go there. Obviously, there's nothing in the lease now. We should consider that as we're moving forward. The second thing I want to mention is, once again, I think these are really great commitments. I think Matthew's still sitting up there. And they're really great commitments. I think you guys are doing a great job partnering in the community. But I think what's important for us to remember is, to me, this is not a community benefits agreement when we're talking about a community benefits agreement similar to the sort of binding commitments we see across the facility at the soccer club. You guys may disagree, and I would love to be educated if I'm wrong about that, but I think we should view this as a first step, but not a last step.
Thank you, Commissioner Hartley. Commissioner Owens?
Yes, with the Speedway Children's Charities, you said establishing a local chapter. What's the typical staff for those chapters? Number of staff people?
I am not the most knowledgeable about Speedway Children's Charities, so a handful of employees and a board.
And how would they be chosen? Or is there someone already in line to run that?
It hasn't been established yet, so we would choose established community folks, and we would have to figure out who to hire to run that.
Okay, and I would also, you have Fall, Hamilton, and Glencliff down here. Whitsett Elementary is very close, so if one of you all could reach out to Whitsett Elementary and try to add them to see what they may need, I would appreciate that, because I attended that school in first grade.
We're happy to work with any Metro Nashville public school, and we expect to work with a lot of them, not just the two listed here.
All right, well, appreciate it, because it's right around the corner.
Yep.
All right.
Commissioner Avila, do you have any questions?
Just a comment to Commissioner Hartley's point. I think as we think about the next step, and fortunately or unfortunately, we're on the same campus. So I think the clarification of what those community benefits agreements are from one or the other. And I do agree with your initial comment that their ability to build out, right, and the infrastructure is very different. And so I completely agree with you, and I appreciate that, because I think that's important to know as we think about the overall complex that we're managing here. I will say though, since we opened the door, so I was a proud board member of Conexión Americas for 6 years and on the executive board. So if I were to put that hat back on, I see these, partnering and supporting. As a board member, if I were there, I would be asking about what specifically, how much, what does that look like? What is the commitment from BMS for the organization? And I assume that that's where some of the discussion was going from Commissioner Hartley is, I think as we continue this, that this is a great start, but I think we need to see some real numbers and some real commitments of this community benefits agreement.
Yeah, just briefly, our approach has been to approach the organizations that we're partnering with and come alongside to ask what they need, and it is going to grow as we get more staff here and get established. So that is something that I fully expect.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, if I just really quick. And I think it's important for us to understand that this is not a community benefits agreement, but a community benefits commitment versus an agreement. And that is one of the major differences between the two. What you had at the soccer club is that it was an agreement that was signed by the bodies, but that too, because of state law, it cannot really, Metro can't really enforce that either or be involved in that as well. Because it sets some of the similar stipulations like $15.50 minimum wage and, you know, and a couple of other items that were in there. So I just want us to understand, like, if there was a, you know, so this language is a commitment, that was an agreement, you know, and also Metro Council actually required that to be signed before they even before they voted on it. This is actually a sign already before, so I think it's a good step, as you mentioned. But you know, I think as we grow and as we continue, that there will be some other things that, you know, that we could talk about, because I would love to see about electric vehicles. You know, and I mean, it's happening all around us, and I do not want our young people to miss out on the opportunities. You know, and plus, if we're going to be seeking NASCAR, as I stated, I think in our first meeting, that NASCAR, you know, is moving towards electric vehicles. So I don't want us to continue to talk about what's happening today, but looking towards the future. Because once this is done, it's not going to be done until 2026. And we're still talking about 2022 and 2023.
So I'm going to interject here. I have Ann who wants to say something, and then I want John to clarify Metro Council, and then I have a question for Tom, and then we'll continue.
Well, sure, just to clarify and follow up on what we were discussing earlier, is that a decision about the proposal before you isn't contingent on the community benefits agreement or any of its specific contents. So just to clarify sort of process. Thanks.
Thank you. John, do you want to speak to what the Metro Council did?
Thank you, Chair. So I was legal director for the city at the time the soccer deal was being negotiated, and including the community benefits component. As we were going through the negotiation, it became very clear that because of the limitations that Mr. Cross mentioned, we legally could not be a party or involved in the negotiation of that agreement as a city. So that was left up to the private parties. The council, when they considered the agreement, they could not make their consideration contingent upon that agreement being negotiated or signed. Individual council members could make their own statements or opinions about what they would or would not support. And so I think that's kind of where I think there were some council members that indicated that that was very important to them, but it was not a part of the council consideration.
Thank you. And Tom, can you share how this compares to what the Titans have done? Is there any comparison?
I'm actually not very familiar with they've certainly made some announcements about supporting local high schools with new football field surfaces and things like that, and they have a pretty well established community participation, and they show up at everything. I don't know about specific community benefits agreements. They've just demonstrated over their time in Nashville that that's part of what they do.
Thank you. What other commissioners have questions or comments at this point?
Madam Chair, if I could address the Titans.
Absolutely, please.
So WALA represents the Titans as well, and so their community benefits plan is separate agreements with a variety of different organizations, community organizations and nonprofits. So it's not one comprehensive agreement. It's similar to what Bristol's doing. It's individual commitments and agreements with nonprofits. It was a plan that they worked on for a long time, put a lot of effort into.
Thank you for that enlightenment. Commissioner Hartley, do you have any other questions? Commissioner Owens, do you have any questions? Commissioner Avila?
No question, but just a comment, especially about the Titans agreement. I think that's one that was very interesting from the community, was also their interest and ability in the new stadium, in the use of the space for community organizations, which was really exciting from the organizations that I've talked to. So it was that in terms of carving out some of that space outside of events so that nonprofits in our community could use it. So that was something that was very interesting and appreciated by the community groups.
Commissioner Hartley?
No, I just wanted to thank
okay.
you. I don't know if I've said that before, but thank you, Matt, for the presentation. Thank you for your partners for showing up. It's a very important discussion. It's something that we heard over and over again, that there needs to be. And so I'm glad to be able to say that you all have done the work. You've talked to community members. I just hope that we continue to talk to community members and maybe bring more people into the fold so that we can continue to educate the citizens.
Okay, well, I believe we're ready to move on. Again, thank you so much for being here and visiting with us about this and giving us the update. We really appreciate it. I'm going to call on Jack Wrightson now with Wrightson, Johnson, Haddon, and Williams, and he's going to go over the environmental sound modeling study. And he is not an audiologist.
Members, Chair, I'm glad to be here with you again and really appreciate you guys showing so much serious attention to this topic that we have here. Some of you, most of this information has been presented to the board before, and so I'm going to spend more time on the new information than I am on the old information, but please do not hesitate to stop me if there's anything on the older stuff that, there's some new members and things like that if people want to go into some further detail on that. Catch words I hear, okay. So one of the things that, and I think you all have a hard copy package of this as well. So one of the things that we talk about, and when we started working with Bristol on this, the idea was, how can we make this a better situation from a community noise standpoint than it is now? So we're not representing that, all the sound is going away any more than the builder of a freeway would. But what we're trying to do is create a better situation in the community than what exists currently. And we think that we have some mitigation measures that allow that to happen and happen in a significant way. So let's talk about what those are. The first one is in any activity like this, we have what we refer to as administrative controls. In this case, the administrative controls are a limit to the number of race event days, the noisy days. That doesn't limit all kinds of other things they can be doing at the facility. But in terms of to use a colloquialism, high octane race days, that's being agreed to, limited to 10 of those per year. A limit to one NASCAR weekend per year. NASCAR being considered in our study as the noisiest event. And then there's a curfew on event start and stop times. So what we want to do is give the community a sort of time certain realization that things aren't going to be running till 2 in the morning or something silly like that. So these are all administrative controls that help. Now, one of the things we talk about in noise control world is the immediate single event, ongoing continuous type noise level. How loud is it? So when I speak to you right now, it's a certain decibel level at your ears. But if I were to sit here and be talking to you this loud for hours on end, then we have a certain time exposure. And we also want to address exposure and as well as the single event or the continuous ongoing noise at the same time. And one of the things that we're doing with the curfews and limiting the number of events is we're limiting the amount of exposure that the neighborhood has for these events over the course of a year. So the same way that you might say that, hey, they have 4th of July once a year, I can put up with the fireworks. It's the same sort of thing. If they were doing that every weekend, then you would have a different opinion about it. It's just human psychology. So one of the things we're trying to do is limit the overall exposure that people have by limiting the number of events. We're also trying to limit how much noise there is, period. And when we talk about that, the way we're proposing to do that is once again, there's several things of that. We have new construction areas. There's construction that's going on right now. We have the renovated grandstand structure. And in addition to that, we have the expo buildings and MLS stadium. All of these things act as barriers to noise. But the most important barrier is the combination of the grandstand and what Bristol is committed to doing a continuous wall around the racetrack that basically connects unbroken from one edge of the grandstand to the other. And we'll be talking a little bit about walls here in a second because I think it's an important topic for people to appreciate and understand. And then the last thing is that one of the things that historically, and there was a comment earlier about the promoters at the Fairground Speedway, is that Bristol intends to mandate the use of mufflers for all non-NASCAR events. And so what happens is, even though there's technically for like Pro Late Model, the PLM cars, theoretically a muffler requirement in place and a certain noise level at such a distance from the car on a run-up, that hadn't been enforced in the past, and Bristol intends to require those things to stay in effect. So the cars themselves or the noise sources get quieter for all those other 9 weekends a year. So what we've done is we've lowered the sound source for the 9 weekends of the year, and we've lowered how much sound escapes from the facility by erecting the walls. So the net result of that is that we're expecting 6-7 dB reduction in the neighborhoods compared to our baseline model, which was, and the measurements we've been, as everyone knows, this process has been going on for a while, the 2019 All-American 400. And so the noise levels noise level measurements were made out in the community for that race, as well as ambient measurements, so we would know what the noise levels were when there was no racing going on at the same time. And we have a table of that, a summary table of that as we go farther into the presentation. But we're expecting that even with a NASCAR weekend with these mitigation measures, that we're expecting noise levels to be lower in the neighborhood, or not any worse to lower in the neighborhood than they were for the All-American 400, the way it was being conducted in 2019. So we're seeing a net benefit in terms of reduced noise levels across the entire season, racing season, as well as the individual event noise levels as well. So the overall noise reduction over the 10-week and compared to having equivalent type races, having an All-American 400 10 times a year, we're expecting the noise exposure to be about half from a loudness standpoint from what the residents have experienced in the past. So if we keep on going, Laura. So this next chart basically shows the measurement locations that we had all around in the community. And obviously, if you're at a distance, you can't see that, but those with the hard copy can reference that. So we'll move along on that one. And here's a table of those locations, and basically it says what the comparisons are in sound levels. And it also lists those ambient sound levels when racing's not occurring. And as you might imagine, in the whole territory, the number of roadways and freeways and highways and stuff that are going on around there, it's an urban area, so it's not out in the countryside. So the noise levels are appreciable anytime during the day. And that's not to say they're high, it's just not extremely quiet. And then we also have the sound level comparison of different automobiles that we use for the modeling. So when we do the modeling, we use a internationally recognized noise modeling, 3D noise modeling program called SoundPlan, and we can enter in the racetrack and all the buildings and import the USGS topographic map, so we have all that data that's in there as well. And then what's every bit as important of that, if not more so, is that we have reference noise levels for each of the types of vehicles that we're talking about. So we have measurements at actual measurements that we did at the All-American 400, as well as the NASCAR COTA race from a couple of years ago in different conditions there, as well as other from literature sources. So we have a pretty good reference database of what the noise levels ought to be that factor into the model. This is just a chart. I won't go through it, but this is just, one of the things that often confuses people when they start talking about noise is there's a difference between loudness and decibels. And loudness is your perceived impression of how the energy or how loud a noise source might be, what the total impact is on you. Decibels are the objective measurement of it, and they're done on a logarithmic scale because we have such a wide range of dynamic range of the human ear for hearing between very loud sounds and very quiet sounds. So in order to make the numbers manageable, they use a logarithmic scale, and I won't go into the arithmetic of that. But basically, in dB, depending on the nature of the sound source, a 3 to 6 dB increase is a doubling of energy. So if I have 70 dB and 70 dB, the net result on my sound level meter is 73 typically, if it's not the exact same noise. So that confuses people that have two things and only goes up 3, and that's because it's a logarithmic scale. The other rule of thumb that's useful is when you're talking about dB and relating it back to loudness, is that a change of 6 to 10 dB, either going up or going down, represents either a doubling or a halving of loudness perceptually. So that's just, so when you look at it, sometimes people say, you know, well, it's 50, it's 100, that's twice as much. Actually, the difference between 50 and 100 is a whole lot more than twice as much because of the logarithmic nature of the scale. Going on. One of the things that we're getting into the new information part of it. And one of the pieces of feedback we got was a lot of people say, well, sound walls don't work on highways, how are they going to work here? And what the sound walls are doing in a highway situation is fundamentally different from what we're doing here. The physics of it is the same. So if you look at this graph or chart, it's basically showing a noise source, it's showing a wall, showing a resonance. The way sound walls work are by blocking off line of sight of the sound from the car, in this case, or the noise source, to wherever our listener position is. And let's just assume it's a resonance. So between the car and the resonance, if we block off that line of sight, the sound has to travel a much longer distance to go over the top of the wall down to the resonance than it does straight through it. So the wall has to be substantially robust enough that the sound going through the wall isn't already louder than what's going over the top. So that's why things like if you used a textile wall, a tent or something like that, they don't make very good sound barriers. So the sound barriers need to be relatively massive and have a high, what we call surface weight or pounds per square foot to do that. And then the wall needs to be tall enough, A, to block line of sight, and B, the taller it is, the bigger that path length difference is, and the more it reduces sound. The third part of this that's important is the closer either the listener or the sound source is to the wall, the more reduction you get. Okay, so if I move that house farther and farther to the right on the screen, it's actually going to reduce the amount of attenuation the wall provides. The flip side of that is the farther it gets away, the more the sound is reduced. So at some point, we'll see this in some of the contour maps that we're going to look at later. We see that it sort of all balances out once we get out to the far field, and we get way out into the far field, you know, a mile, 2 miles away, the race, that sound is diminished from race so much that it's basically at the ambient level. Not that you can't hear it and distinguish it, but if you were to measure it on a sound level meter, it wouldn't be that much different. Let's keep going, please. So if we have a typical sound wall, the other thing is that we want to point out is when you do a sound wall design for a highway and you're doing it to the federal standards and using the Optima Standard computer model, it is looking for hitting a particular level at a particular point on the ground in order to meet the minimum requirement. So if they measure the sound levels or calculate it based on traffic counts and the distances, and it's over, and a common number is 65 dB for a 24-hour average, including a 10 dB penalty after 10 p.m. And this is for a continuous stream for 24 hours, which kind of makes sense for a roadway. It can be busy 24 hours a day. The racetrack's not busy 24 hours a day, so that standard doesn't apply. But those sound walls are only intended to lower the levels down to that 65 24 hours a day. That's actually a fairly high level. It's not a real high bar that they're asking the sound wall people to jump over. Also, as you can see in this picture, because the computer modeling does it as a point near the ground, if you're in a second or third story of a building, a residential building, multifamily, you may not be breaking line of sight to the sound wall. You can look right down on the cars because they're not required to build it that high. So they only build it to meet the particular standard, federal standard, That's, for the funding that's required for federal. Now, they're also, I'm going back to federal because it's the most common one, there are also state regulations and rules and stuff about that as well. So what we're trying to do is something a little bit different. We're not trying to build a highway sidewall, we're trying to build a superior sidewall. Keep going. So we're trying to, we have a couple of advantages. One is we don't have multiple lanes. We don't have 8-lane highway with a median in between and a big shoulder on the side. We get to put the walls really close to the cars, and they tend to run around the outside of the track. So the wall and the grandstand are always close to the track. And so that helps us because it puts us closer to the wall, it makes it more effective. The other thing that we worry about, and this happens with, especially in the United States with sound walls all the time, is they are sound reflective. They may block sound, but the sound that hits them, so you can see the sound, the blue line, it hits the green wall, bounces back, and actually can make it louder on the other side of the road. So how do you solve that problem? Let's go ahead. So, and here's a real world example. And this also applies where we have the parallel walls here. So keep going, Laura. So what happens is we don't want the sound bouncing off the walls and making it louder on the other side. So what we're designing for the fairgrounds renovation is a sound absorptive wall. You see this extremely rarely in the United States for these highway sound walls. This is a fundamental difference from what we're doing. You do see it sometimes at airports where areas where the jets will run up and things like that, and in industrial environments and things like that. But what we're doing here is putting these sound absorptive walls on it, so we dramatically reduce the reflection. The kind of walls that we're proposing on this would reduce the reflected sound by about 80%. They're that effective. So if we go on to the next slide, we can sort of show you, this is a typical wall. This one's along a rail corridor. Our walls are actually proposed to be taller than this, but you can see it's basically a metal wall. It's got perforated panels. One more, Laura, please. And then we've got fiberglass or mineral wool inside it. That's actually the material that's doing the work of absorbing the sound. It goes in through the sound enters into the fiberglass through the perforated panels, and it does that. And as I mentioned earlier, the overall assembly has to be massive enough or heavy enough that sound doesn't just go right through it. So I just wanted to make sure that because the issue of what's the difference from a highway sound wall that might not be all that effective, and just to summarize this, highway sound walls are only as effective as they're required to be, and not anymore, okay? We're trying to do a better job than that, because we're trying to achieve a situation where we're not trying to hit a standard. What we're trying to do is make it better than it is now. That's our criteria that we've set for this project. So let's keep going. So let's look at what the modeling results tell us. So like I said, we use the 3D computer modeling, we import the buildings, we import the white buildings or the ones not built. And what we've done with these charts is, this is a difference. So when you look at that chart and on the colored scale, the darker colors, the purple and the green, represent more reduction in sound. And as we get up to the red would be an increase in sound. And so what we're looking at is the difference between the 2019 late pro model race and what would happen, that's without mufflers, and what would happen if we added the 20-foot sound wall and the existing speedway. So as you can see, if I after I renovate the building, if I do the 2009 race, that's how much reduction I get. Go to the next one, please. If I also add the mufflers, this is the reduction we get. So as you can see, the mufflers are a big deal. And it's important that be enforced in order to get these kind of results. So it's substantially quieter for that type of event. Next one, please. Now we're also talking about NASCAR. So NASCAR, we're assuming, as you saw in the earlier chart, is a louder event. The cars are noisier. But what we've done here is, if we have a NASCAR race, using the data we collected at an actual NASCAR race, and we have a renovated speedway with the sound walls, and we compare that to the 2019 race, this is the kind of reduction we get. And this is why we say that the NASCAR event is going to be no worse, and in most places better, and from a noise standpoint, than what the residents experienced in 2019 at the All-American 400. Next one, please. No, so one of the questions we had early on, and Sherry was one of the people that was pushing us this way, is, well, it's great that we're seeing what's in the neighborhoods close by. What happens if we extend it all the way out? So this is basically a 2-mile radius from the fairgrounds. And as you can see, we have those good improvements close by. NASCAR versus the 2019 race, where the NASCAR is just a little bit better. That as we get farther and farther away, that sort of evens out, and at some point it hits what the ambient levels are already out there in the absence of racing. So if we go to the next one, Laura, this is an actual sound contour map, and people in the audience can't see this, it's too small, but it actually lists sound levels. And if you compare some of those sound levels that are way out there to what the ambient noise levels are, then you can see that we quickly, within the scale of the area that's shown on this map, the racing is no louder than what the ambient noise levels are out there. So any questions about any of that data, or how it was developed, or what it means or anything like that? Does anyone have to this point?
I have a question. I'll go first this time. And this may be more of a question for NASCAR, for Bristol rather, and it's the nature, and Bob's going to laugh at me, it's the nature of the mufflers. The muffler requirement, is that going to be a stipulated muffler per se, or is that going to be a specific sound level, X number of feet from the sound source? Anybody want to take that?
Go ahead.
With Laura and Bob Sargent, the existing promoter, on what's working now. We want to make sure that we identify what makes the most sense to have the greatest impact. So it's not a direct answer to your question, but to answer your question is, we'll look at it that way. We'll look at both. It may be that it's hard to specify one. So you could identify 2 or 3, and you have to use one of these. And I think that's what they do now. Is that correct, Laura?
Yeah.
Or we could just use whatever muffler you want, and we'll measure you at an X distance from that point.
Yeah,
or a combination of the two?
Or a combination of the two.
Yes, when you look at some of the regulations for the racing series, so some of the racing series also have their own noise requirements because they know they live in the real world. And you'll see exactly what Jerry was talking about, in that it'll be X dB at Y feet. You know, when you run it up to full RPM, that's the number. You can measure it on site, and they have a list of approved mufflers that go with it. So it's up to the facility and the racing sanctioning body to come to agreement on what that's supposed to be. Do you agree with that, Jerry?
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
For the record, I would love to be part of that conversation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask a follow-on question to your question, Jerry?
Absolutely.
It's for Jerry and Tom probably, or John and Tom. The term muffler is not defined in the operating agreement, and it should be defined. We should do exactly what Jerry just promised as far as picking out certain types of mufflers. We should make that part of the agreement. It should be not an open-ended, any type of muffler. We should define that term.
And what I would suggest in the interest of ease of enforcement as well as technical compliance is that the mufflers will change over time. So the manufacturers come and go, the type of mufflers, the technology they use, that will come and go. What you really want to do, and to Sherry's point, is that you're better off stipulating the maximum level at a given distance, and then we worry about how we achieve that. Does that make sense?
I concur, and that would be the smart way to draft it. Obviously, we're still in the sort of fact-finding phase of this whole thing, so obviously we're not proposing amendments yet, but hopefully maybe we can make that happen.
I don't know.
John?
I also wanted to note that there are minimum standards that will be in the agreement, and so that could be incorporated as well. But again, it's a 30-year lease, and we don't know what mufflers will look like in 15 years. So.
Okay, Commissioner.
And I just had a follow-up question, and it was about the noise and the definition of what a race car is, and the noise level there is 90 dBA. Was your study done based on that noise level at 500 feet from the source?
Yes, so what we use for the source, so we use the number of cars, so like 33 cars for an NASCAR race. So that chart that was sort of at the beginning of the presentation, the bottom half of that tells you the noise levels we used for particular vehicle types. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask for the record because it was brought up at the last meeting. So I just want to make sure that the constituents know that we've asked the question, we've done our due diligence.
Yeah, we weren't assuming a pack of Teslas running around.
All right.
Yeah.
Commissioner Hartley, you have any questions?
I've got a whole list of them. Do you want to finish yours?
Fabulous. No, that was my big question.
Okay. All right. Number one, thank you so much for speaking with us. It's very helpful. And honestly, this is important. This is the number one complaint, or not complaint, the number one piece of community input I think we've heard. So I appreciate Bristol taking it very seriously and us spending time on it. So just a couple of questions. I get the vibe you are potentially an expert witness from time to time. So sorry if these questions are, don't take them in bad faith, but who commissioned this study is the first question.
Bristol.
Okay. And tell us about Wright Johnson. What do you guys do?
So we are acoustical consultants. We have a practice that specializes in a couple of things, but one of them is sports and entertainment. So on the resume item, you see some of the sports facilities we did, including the soccer stadium here in town, where we design work, we do noise, we do room acoustics, we work on entertainment, concert venues, and we also do noise control. We do, so for example, you can hear the air conditioning system, or tonight, the heating system going on in the room and stuff like that, and we work with mechanical engineers to keep those quiet. We also do a lot of environmental noise for sports and entertainment facilities. So if it's a stadium and they're having a concert or an outdoor amphitheater or a motorsports facility, what kind of noise does it generate? How does it affect the community? How can the operator or owner, make it more quiet and more community friendly? So that's the practice we do. We've been in business since 1990. I've been in business, I've been in the industry for another 8 years beyond that, before we started this company. So this is something to do, and we work all over the country, and we have a certain limited number of international projects as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So to summarize, you guys are sort of consultants to help sort of maximize the noise in a particular project. If this project is built, would you don't do the construction though? That sounds like that's a separate.
We don't do the construction. So one of the things that we do is we will advise, we will do drawings, we will recommend products. So for example, one of the things that we're in discussion with Bristol on in terms of their construction activities is what is the right product for the sound wall? One of the things that we would typically do is verify the final design of it, because a lot of it will be done by a structural engineer, because of the foundations are a big deal for a wall this tall. So to make sure that we don't have gaps in it, that we haven't overlooked something, that it connects to the grandstand properly and does all that stuff, because we want to make sure it's built to the same assumptions that the model was there. And if it's not, we need to identify what the differences are going to be if it wasn't.
Thank you.
So it's important to close that circle.
Absolutely. And in the lease, there's a provision that talks about monitoring sound levels. Would that be something that you guys would also do potentially? We do. Because we're out of town, it's probably going to be more efficient for Bristol to hire, local people to do that. But I'm trying to get you some business here. Just kidding.
But yeah, no. So yeah, we make them. For example, we did all the made idles noise measurements at the 19 All-American 400 and stuff like that. And it's something we can do. And we have as you might imagine, we have a fleet of sound level meters that in environmental enclosures that we go out and can park them there for quite a while and do these measurements and stuff, and they report back via the cell system and things like that. So not unlike an airport noise monitoring system.
Thank you. So now I had a couple questions about your presentation, and I do appreciate you going back through it. As Jasper and I were just talking, I think I heard your presentation a year ago when I was a community member, but I think most of us are new, so it's very helpful to go over it. So just a couple questions. Number one, on the executive summary page. So starting with, obviously, I understand the administrative limits are sort of top line. We're going to limit the number of loud events so we don't have constant impact on people's hearing in the community. A couple of questions on these. Jasper kind of hit on it in his question, but we have the 10 race weekends, we have the NASCAR weekend. I guess first question for Tom is, I couldn't tell from the lease or the operating agreement, is the NASCAR weekend in addition to the 10? Just to make sure I understand that.
It's one of the 10.
Okay. And John, Bristol understands that there would be 10 total as well?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Awesome. I thought that was clear, but I just wanted to make sure. So the first question for you, as you're thinking about a sound mitigation program, are there, and obviously you don't know the entire scope of potential uses for the facility, but would the sound mitigation plan that you guys are putting together, would it be effective for all the other types of events that could be held in the facility? Two ones that come to mind. Number one, obviously there's non-race car events that could be held here with other types of events. I used to be an attorney for Nissan, and I did lots of, ride and drives and things like that. And then second, there's also potential to use this facility for concerts. So how would you interpret those potential type of events happening when you're thinking about the administrative limits on the sort of noise potential in the facility? Is that clear what I'm asking?
Yeah, so let's cut right to it. The event that, a Nissan or other automaker type event is not going to be an impact because of the speeds not achieved and the fact these are production cars and things like that. They're much, much quieter, fortunately. The event that's most likely to have a significant community noise input is a large outdoor concert. And I'm not talking about a band that's playing on the backside of the grandstand, for the people that are milling around before or after an event or something. I'm talking about a large concert that you might have in a stadium or a large outdoor amphitheater. And the administrative controls for that are very, very similar to what you would have for the racing events. So having worked on literally dozens of outdoor music facilities, the things that matter are number of events, how long they run, is it just an evening event, is it an all-day festival? There's some things like that. So these administrative controls work very well. The other thing has to do with the fact that the barriers are also very effective for that as well. Okay, our source sound levels are a little bit higher, but there's a whole lot fewer of them than there are with tens of cars on the track at any one time. So but it's a little bit more directional, and you would be playing typically towards the grandstand. So it's a little bit of a different study, but the noise mitigation measures that you take, especially administrative ones, are very, very similar.
Thank you. Just to say that back, I think I understand you to say the administrative side, we'd want to have things like similar to we would have for races. We'd want to have curfews and days of the week and things like that. And then on the physical barrier side, those are equal, or not equally, but similarly effective for concerts as they are for racing events.
Yeah, it's a little bit different. The sound source is at a different elevation. It's at a different location than it is, at the track. So depending on where the stage is, how close it is to the grandstands, far away. So it's a little bit different exercise on that. It has, unlike the racetrack, which pretty much puts out the same amount of noise around its whole circumference, the concert is more directional. So on the grandstand side, it's going to be noisier. Behind to the other side of it, it's going to be quieter by comparison.
So I should request that Jerry face the concerts away from my house, is what you're saying. I'm just kidding. I'm just making a joke.
Work out with Jerry.
But I heard. What about one of our presentations that we heard? There was talks about a possibility of monster trucks. So what about monster trucks? Like, will that sound barrier, how does the sound barrier stands up to that of a monster truck?
So it's a little bit different. The sound barrier still works. If the monster trucks are running around on the infield, the sound barrier is going to be a little bit affected than it is if the cars are right up against it, like we discussed earlier. But as long as it's breaking line of sight, it's giving us attenuation. Okay. The other good thing about monster trucks is, not unlike the concert, is we have fewer sound sources at once. And it's a little bit less, it's more episodic, it's not as continuous. Yeah.
Tom, I guess the next question is for you. Thinking about the administrative limits, I see in the operating agreement the administrative limits as they relate to race, but I don't see, and tell me if I'm wrong, I may have missed this, are there any limits on the number of concerts or other non-race car events that could occur? And the reason I'm asking the question is if we're relying in some part on the administrative limits to be part of our sound mitigation, if we don't have a limit in the contract on the number of loud concerts every year, how effective are those limits?
There's not currently a limit on the number of events. There is a limit on the hours when amplified sounds are permitted. 10 p.m. is the limit.
Is amplified sound defined? And the reason I ask is that would clearly apply to concerts, but I think our community is very concerned about this sort of donut hole between a race car event. We have concerts over here, but there's other types of loud events like monster truck races, dirt bike races. There could be production vehicles that have been modified that could be below the level of 90 decibels. Are there any sound mitigation administrative limits related to those?
There's not currently, at least not for there's a fairly extensive section that has to do with when races and practices are permitted, hours of the day and days of the week. There's not a comparable section for other noise sources.
Let me just interject here quickly. Laura and I just dealt with soccer on the concert that they wanted to bring, and there are no limits within soccer insofar as the number. We do have curfew, but there are no limits with soccer. John?
Thank you. I would also note that there's a provision in the agreement that requires Bristol to comply with all reasonable Fair Board rules and regulations related to the use of the property in general. So there are some controls built in.
John, I appreciate that, but also anything that has any material impact on Bristol's ability to make money, you can terminate the contract on 30 days notice if you disagree with the regulation. So that's not much of a real check. What I think we as a board should do is we should evaluate whether there should be a curfew, should be other limits on noise generating events. Again, this is the number one thing we heard from the community was that there's concern about noise. So I think I really appreciate the work that Bristol has done to put a sound mitigation plan in place for race events. I don't see as much work, and perhaps that's an area of work for us to consider for non-race events.
Let me just throw out there a question to Bristol, and John or Jerry opine here. What I think might be helpful is for us to learn how much or how many of these concert type events are factored into your financial pro forma. And that's redundant, but you get my drift. And we need to understand that to make sure that we don't have day over day, week over week, weekend over weekend noise that's not part of those 10 race weekends. Jerry?
Is that on? What's contemplated in our projections is 2 to 3 music events. So 2 whenever we have a NASCAR weekend and 3 when there's not a NASCAR Cup weekend.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that, Jerry. Would you guys be willing to, and you don't have to negotiate on the spot, but you have limits on the number of race weekends. Obviously, without binding your hand, would you be willing to consider limits on the number of concerts that you have in the facility?
I think an important piece, and Sherry touched on it, is that we're all treated equal. All parties on the property that are stakeholders are treated equal. So if there needs to be a conversation around everyone being treated equal, yeah, I think we're open to that conversation. I think the other piece that I want to point out that is important for all these, whether there's community benefits agreement and are we going to keep that, or those types of questions that you could speculate on what happens in 10 or 15 years. I just want to stress this is an agreement for a partnership. Yes, we would be leasing the facility, but we would still be working hand in hand with the Fair Board and this property to execute. I mean, we'll be back at every Fair Board meeting. We'll be working with Laura or whoever is executive director in 30 years on a daily basis to be able to pull our events off. So we're still going to have to be working hand in hand. There's still going to be time where we're held accountable and expect to be held accountable and are completely fine with that. So some of these things that are concerns, just know it's not like we're signing something and then we disappear for 30 years and there's no way to hold us accountable. We expect to be held accountable.
I appreciate that, Jerry, and I agree because you structured the deal very well. I mean, we all make money in the same way. So obviously, we're all incentivized to have positive events that generate revenue and bring people to the site. So I definitely appreciate that. And there's certainly a lot of partnership elements. Don't want to give the impression that I don't feel that way. I 100% agree. And I think you guys are going to be a great operator. I think the main thing we've heard from the community, though, is noise mitigation. So your point well taken on other tenants on the site, how we treat the rest of the tenants on the site, and an overall site plan is something we should really talk about. But those are all really good points. But I do think we should still consider where we're going with noise events that are outside of the very detailed plan we have for racing events.
Yeah, and with this, I mean, because if we do that, we're going to have the conversation with the Visitors and Convention Bureau, because part of their agreement is to lease it for 20 days. And we haven't said what those 20 days consist of. So are they planning to bring the New Year's bash here, that they do on New Year's Eve on CBS? Or, so that's to your point. If we're going to have the conversation with Bristol, we're going to have it with everybody that's involved.
Well, and the CVC would fall under the same parameters of our contract, so they would have time limits on any event that produces noise. So no, they couldn't do that without some sort of variance or approval from you guys, because they would have to end it by, I think it's 10 p.m.
I'm sorry, Tom, there's not anything in the contract that says non-race events have to end at a certain time. I appreciate the sentiment. I just want to make sure that we're all working on the same facts.
Well, for concerts, I would say they have to end at 10 because there's a limit of 10 p.m. on amplified sound.
Point taken. Thank you, Jerry.
Commissioners, do you have any more questions? Go.
Again, back to the sound study. Thank you so much again. I think turning to the page, I don't have them numbered here, but it's sort of this graph. We can put that on the screen. This is the graph I'm looking at. I really just would love for you to kind of walk through this and sort of explain to us what this doesn't. I don't understand this today, and so I would love a little more explanation of kind of what we're comparing here, just to help us know, because I think this is the chart that sort of creates these really helpful map studies.
Okay, so let's go through a column left to right. Location, those numbers are on the prior slide, the overall area plan. So if you flip back in your hard copy, you can see how those match up. And that's on that topo graph. And then those are the distance from the racetrack. So why do we worry about distance? Because as we said earlier, sound reduces in intensity over distance, it gets quieter. And so it's important if you're comparing different locations for the measurements, it's useful to know how far away they were. Otherwise, the fact that one's quieter and one's noisier doesn't necessarily make any sense. The next one we have is LEQ is an average sound level measurement. And I'm not reading it over. It says in there over what the duration is.
So that third column looks like the All-America 400.
It's the All-American 400.
Pro-late model.
Pro-late model, and that's the 2019 race that we're using as our baseline. And since that was the biggest event prior to Bristol renovating the building.
And that was in 2019. There was actually sound levels taken at that event.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, at those locations that are listed there. Okay. And then what we do is this is the predicted NASCAR level with the 20-foot sound wall by comparison to the 2019. So you're comparing in column 3 and column 4 the difference between the calculated or predicted NASCAR level with the walls against what the community experienced in 2019 with the existing facility and the pro-late model. Then the last two columns are no race measurements made at those same locations. So as you can appreciate, this was done over several days. And then we have one on the left is the average short-term average sound level. And why do you do a short-term average sound level? Because if let's say you're in someone's front yard and a car drove by and you only took that brief period of time when the car went by, it would be a much higher level. It wouldn't really be a fair representation of what someone's experiencing all day long. So we do an average sound level there, so it's more representative of what the typical is. And then the other one is the maximum sound level. So that would be when the garbage truck came by and emptied the dumpsters, or whatever it was that created the maximum sound level during that measurement period. So just to tell you what that difference is. So we all know from our everyday existence, you know, between things like picking up the trash, lawn equipment, you know, construction, heavy trucks on the street in front of you, there's all kinds of things that on a very short-term basis can dramatically affect how loud it is at any given time. So we sort of do the average to typical and then the max, which is sort of the worst case scenario. Does that explain what the columns mean?
It does, thank you, that's very helpful. And then the bottom, we're seeing car source sound level comparisons. What is explain sort of, what is this telling us at the bottom?
Okay, so that is the different types of vehicles that we're using to do the modeling. So we had the actual measurements because we made measurements inside the facility as well as outside the facility in 2019. So we know how loud those cars were right up against the rail. And then we have the measurements we made at the NASCAR race at COTA, which is Circuit of the Americas outside of Austin. And so we have those measured. And then because that's a road course, they have very, very different vehicle dynamics, whether they're on a straightaway or coming out of a turn. So we captured both of those, the straight being the one that's the most applicable in the case of the Fairground Speedway. And so we're basically showing the different car types, and then we have the levels that do that. So why is this important? To go back to the question earlier in the session one of the questions was, well, what did you use as your car sound source? Well, this is the data we used. Okay, now, everything you saw today is basically based on the All-American 400, the 19 data, and the measured NASCAR data. So both sets are actual measured data at races.
Got you. So just to clarify that and make sure I understand, or crystallize that, what we're seeing is we're comparing sort of 2019 All-American 400 Pro Late model actual sound levels, and then these charts of the graphs of the maps, apologies for not saying it correctly, is sort of comparing that would have happened if we had a renovated speedway with a new sound wall. This is how the sound will change.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and to be fair, that we've used a very sophisticated 3D computer model to do that. So we have the inputs. The inputs are the wall, the topographic area, the existing buildings, the future buildings, as well as the the sound, and then we use the sound level, actual sound level measurement to use. The other thing that matters is how many cars are on the track at once. More cars, more noise. So we assumed a full maximum NASCAR field, and we also assumed that they were running around in a bunch. So because, as you can imagine, at any one time, if you're closer to a big pack of cars, that's going to be noisier than if you're on the other side of the track. Now, this is a very short track, so it's not huge differences. But so we sort of took it a worst case scenario. So we had a bunch of cars, they were all going around, and then what we would do is when we average it out, when they go all the way around over time, it's the same as if they were all strung out.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate you walking through. What I see here is essentially, versus baseline 2019, the sound wall is going to be effective. I mean, obviously, some of the maps show some up, some down, but overall it's very effective. So thank you for walking through it. Sorry you had to do it twice because I'm clearly not as sharp, but thank you for that. That's all I have. You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Any other commissioners? Commissioner Owens, do you have any questions?
Yes. What currently is out there on the current fairground racetrack? Do we have any sound walls out there now?
No.
So there's none, not any, okay.
There's nothing. We have a metal grandstand that reverberates like no other.
And a few billboards.
Commissioner Avila, do you have any questions?
No questions, just a comment that I think it would be important for us as a board to think about the overall campus planning as we think about all these events, right? And to your point, thinking about the agreements that we already have in place with other partners on campus. What does that look like? How many events? It's been brought up also in our community listening sessions on just the impact of all of that traffic and all of those events on campus and how that'll affect not only the residents, the schools, but also the community around the fairgrounds.
Laura, do you want to speak to that, or do you want to let us know what you can share?
Well, I will, and I think that goes to the homework and the clarification we made in the minutes. So I have started that chart, and it's getting circulated right now for input. So we hope to have that back to you, hopefully by the next work session. We can have that available to you so you can do that comparison.
Commissioner Hendricks.
I just had one question, and I was trying to find it, but is there a requirement to build a sound wall, a part of this project? And, yes. Okay, I thought I saw it before. We're paid, well, we could talk about it later, but, yeah.
Well, we may forget. The part of the development agreement is a set of required minimum standards, and the minimum standards effectively require the sound walls.
It's an exhibit. It's an exhibit to the development agreement, I think, right?
It is.
Yes.
That's an important document because it guides the design, and to the extent that changes have to be made in design, to make sure that the costs can be brought within the allowable budget, they can't go below the minimum standards. And this is one that, from the very beginning, has been clear is important both to the Fair Board and the community.
Any other questions? Seeing none, we will move on. Thank you so much, Jack, for your time. We appreciate it. Well, that leaves us to the lease agreement.
Well, I have, as last time, given you a short memo. It's pretty high level, and I'm sure you have more detailed questions. I also know energy may be flagging at this point, and there's another work session scheduled. So if we don't get to everything, or you think of other things, then we can always address it subsequently. But I trust you have the memo, and I'm going to say for the third time, the project is really divided into a first phase and a second phase. And the first phase is the design and development, construction, and that's what the development agreement addresses. And the lease agreement starts when the development agreement ends and the construction project has been completed to really the satisfaction of the Fair Board and of Bristol. The term is 30 years. If you watched the council debate on the term sheet yesterday evening, one of the things that seemed to be important to the members of the council was that the right to extend be on a mutual basis, and in this one, that would be necessary. Neither party has the right to mutually extend the lease on its own. The base rent is $1 million, escalating at 1% per year. There's several other amounts that they will be paying as well. One of them is a payment directly to the Fair Board of $103,125. That also escalates at 1% per year. And I'll touch on this again in a minute, but the Fair Board may also receive another payment of up to that same amount if there's enough in the waterfall to get to that level. In addition, the Fair Board would receive 5% of gross revenues and 15% of food and beverage sales, except for the major event weekends, when Bristol gets all of it. The Fair Board, or the Metro, receives the first $600,000 in sponsorship revenues and 10% of annual facility naming rights. One of the things that Mr. Lenhart looked at specifically was the reasonableness of those projections. One of the exhibits to the lease is a schedule that shows when NASCAR races are expected to be held. And part of the discussion tonight is that they're not required to bring a NASCAR race, but there is a schedule that shows when they're projecting to do so, essentially every other year. The revenues that we talked about at the very, very beginning are matched to that, and you'll see in what I'm going to give you by email shows some annual fluctuation in the total revenues received, and it reflects the fact that the revenues are going to be higher in NASCAR years than in non-NASCAR years. So if the schedule shows that a NASCAR race is to be held and no NASCAR race actually is held, then some additional rent is due to make up what is likely to be a little bit of a deficit there. There's an additional payment if they miss 2 or more in a row, but they get a credit if they bring more NASCAR races than the schedule reflects. This is a net lease, which means that Bristol has to pay for all operating expenses, including utilities and some other things that are on sort of on the Fair Board's side of the ledger at the moment. One of the other things that I have provided in response to a request from Commissioner Hartley is a drawing that's kind of small scale, and I am not a PowerPoint expert, but you'd asked for a graphic representation of what the waterfall looks like. And we went over it last time, and it doesn't come off like poetry, but we can do that again if you like. So there are 4 primary sources of revenue: ticket taxes, seat taxes, which go into a tax revenue fund, and Bristol rent and CVC payments, which go into a lease revenue fund. And it's important at the very end of the waterfall, just in case there's money left over, it gets distributed in part based on the initial source. But all of those revenues go into first to pay bond debt expense. So our first priority is making sure we pay what we owe on the bonds. Second level in the waterfall is a debt service reserve fund to make sure that we've got enough to cover the maximum in any one year that could be due for debt service. So we have a terrible year where no events can be held. We got enough in there to cover at least that 1 year. So the second level in the waterfall after bond debt expense has been paid is to top up that reserve fund. Then the third level is to reimburse Metro, the Fair Board, the authority for bond debt expense that has had to be paid from any other source. Something else that caught the council's attention last night in the term sheet was, what happens if we have a down year and this actually does impact the Metro backstop? We talked about Metro is having to provide a pledge of its so-called non-tax revenues, meaning essentially everything other than property taxes stand behind this deal. If the revenues are not sufficient, there's not enough money in the debt service reserve fund, then Metro has to stand behind that. And I should assuage anybody's concerns that it means that it's all due at once. So we're not going to be confronting a situation where we have to make a $70 million payment. It's, whatever's owed for that year. So Metro has had to do that, in fact, on the baseball stadium for a couple of years, which was impacted by COVID, and also the development in that area didn't proceed as quickly as was expected to provide some revenues that are intended to support those bonds. So long-winded way of saying if anything does hit the Metro backstop, then that's number 3 on the waterfall to repay that. Then there is a deposit to the capital projects fund. This is another valuable lesson we've learned on the existing football stadium is you have to have a robustly funded capital repair fund to make sure that your facility is adequately maintained and there's revenue there without question to cover it. Now, under the terms of the lease, Bristol is responsible for whatever is required to keep the facility in good shape, but it's best to have a revenue source that everybody can count on to make sure that that's done, and we're not fighting with them over what needs to be done. Not that we would expect to, but that has been a source of difficulty in our current football stadium lease.
Tom, that was you made an understatement.
Yes. The next thing, I mentioned this early on, the Fair Board is guaranteed a certain rental payment of about $103,000. If there is enough left in the waterfall at this point, then the Fair Board will get up to that same amount every year. The next stop, again, if money is still available after paying all the preceding items, is a pro rata prepayment or a repayment to Bristol or the authority of project costs that were not funded from the sources that we expect to be available, bonds, the CVC lump sum payment, the state grant, and also cost overruns for which Bristol is responsible and capital improvements that they do which are not funded from this capital projects fund. If the 5 or the 0.5% isn't sufficient to cover something that they have had to do, then they can get repaid in a subsequent year if additional funding is available. Then at the bottom of the waterfall, depending on where the initial revenues came from, like the tax revenues, ticket taxes and seat taxes, if there's money left, go to the revenue funds of the Sports Authority, since they're on the hook for the bonds. And if there is funding left and it originated from rent or the CVC payment, then those get split 75% to Bristol and 25% to the authority. We talked a good bit about operating standards. I'm not going to spend any time on that. I realize that the paragraph I gave you in the memo is almost as long and hard to figure out as the one actually in the lease, but it sets these administrative standards for hours of operation and days of operation that apply to races and practices. They don't apply, to your point, to other kinds of events that we'll look for your guidance on how to land on that. Again, mufflers, we talked a little bit about that, and we've heard you say that you want a standard, not just mufflers, but a defined standard, either a device is capable of reducing by a particular decibel or to a certain level or certain models, but we've heard you on that too, and we'll be talking to you further into Bristol on that. The Fair Board has the right to use the facility when it's not being used for races and other things, particularly the concourses, which can be valuable for the flea market and other kinds of events that the Fair Board has typically put on. And then insurance, there's a long section in there that details the kinds of insurance that Bristol's required to have. It's comparable to the insurance requirements in our other sports facility leases. I should note that Metro itself, the Fair Board will have to have liability insurance to cover events that it wants to hold in the facility. And finally, Bristol's obligations are being backed up by a guarantee provided by its parent. Now that was very high level, and I know you may need more time to think about all the things that have been talked about today, or to review the report that Mr. Lenhart provided, other provisions on the lease, other provisions in the development agreement. I had originally thought that two of these was going to be sufficient, but now I'm glad you scheduled the third. So happy to take on questions tonight, but if you're out of gas, I'll be back.
So I just want to bring up a couple of things, and then we can talk about how we move forward. I definitely think that having another work session or two is absolutely in order. I think that we've all got things that we want to address in terms of all the agreements. And so I will definitely get with Laura and we'll be scheduling that. I have two quick comments, probably need to be discussed at length later. But I'm going to throw two kinks in this. I really believe that the Fair Board money, instead of being split into two pieces, needs to be guaranteed, because we're going to be losing the opportunity to have events here that are revenue generating. And we have to make sure that we're made whole. And if that money isn't guaranteed and we're not made whole, that impacts the Metro Fund, the general fund. And I've got a problem with that. The second thing is going to go back to the sound wall. And the sound wall, remember what he said, that in order to appropriately reduce the sound intensity, sound has to travel a greater distance. If the sound wall is taller, that's a greater distance that the sound has to travel. So if there's potential for a little bit taller sound wall, I think that's really helpful. I think in terms of when you look at the sound wall measurements, not the sound wall measurements, but the raising measurements and the chart that we looked at a few minutes ago, there's an area of several residents where the sound intensity is going to be considerable. It's item number 4. And I would love to find out what the potential reduction would be if that sound wall were taller. Those are my 2 points. I feel like our next meeting needs to be similar to what I've just done, and I've shared my concerns, and need us to maybe take an opportunity for them to get back with one another based on what our concerns are, and then move forward from there. We can do that in the form of another work session. I think that would be helpful for us to ask any questions, and maybe the next work session is based on the questions that we've previously presented, the concerns that we've shared, and have an opportunity to have that dialogue, and then move forward with the following opportunity to kind of coalesce our thoughts. I would love to open the floor to hear what you guys have to say about that. Just hit your button and go.
I would first echo what you said about the rent payment to the board. I think that's something that, to the Fair Board, I think that's something that's critical and important given scheduling. And again, to my previous comment about the work that Laura is doing about just the campus as a whole. And so I that's one of my real challenges is it's not that much money. And I think not having it as a requirement in the agreement is a challenge for me. And so I would just like to echo that on the Fair Board payment. And then to respond to your comment about discussion, I agree. I think we need at least a couple more opportunities. I appreciate the information that we get, but as a Fair Board, for the community and for everyone to understand, is we're not allowed to have open discussion about this outside of these sessions. So it's really hard to be able to have a real discussion amongst ourselves and just having people present to us. The other thing is, I appreciate, Tom, the memo. It's tough when I get it at 10 a.m. the day of the session. We're all working, and so it's really difficult to synthesize. And unfortunately, like our Commissioner Todd Hartley, I am not a lawyer. So it makes it a little bit more difficult. And so I just want to say that it's challenging for us as a commissioner to be thinking about these discussions when you're just being talked to and there's no opportunity for real discussion amongst ourselves.
Yes, I echo, and especially around the holidays when a lot of stuff is going on, and you have to take in a lot of stuff. Now, one thing I would like to have a better understanding of for the next session is that last week during our meeting, we voted on an amendment that would allow Bristol to not use D&D catering, and I would like to take a look at that fiscal impact as to what it really means based off of the current D&D contract and what their requirements are for a buyout. What will we get at, what is that factored into the monetary projections, as well. So I'm very concerned about that part.
Just to clarify, that was with Track Enterprises, not Bristol, the current promoter. So this would be different than, actually it would be much more similar going into the Bristol deal with how Track Enterprises is now with the approved amendment. They would be using their own food and beverage provider, which is what we approved for Track Enterprises during the last meeting. So it actually makes it much more similar.
So, but wouldn't Track Enterprises be the one that they'll be operating under this?
It would, but the agreement would not be with Track Enterprises. It would be with Bristol.
So it would be similar to the soccer stadium. They would be able to use their own vendors, so it's separate from our current agreement with that vendor, which that agreement is up in 2024, so we won't have anything before that, right?
I'm actually not familiar with the agreement that you're talking about.
It's our food vendor agreement that we have with the fairgrounds with a specific vendor, and in our last board meeting, we approved an adjustment to that agreement to allow the current operator to use a different vendor. And so it was that was the difference. My joke was around, regardless, we would have to review that agreement by 2024. And I don't think if this goes well, we'll have a new speedway by 2024.
Sherry, I think another work session is a good idea. I think I have a list of sort of information, and what I'm going to do is just email it to you, Laura. Obviously, I know that you remind us to send questions, and unfortunately, this is the time of year that's impossible to get ahead of. But, I think what we should do is we should all send in the questions that we have for Laura to distribute to the experts that presented to us. A couple of, sort of, to give you an example of what I'm thinking about is things like, I'm still wanting to see that chart of existing uses, potential versus under the New Deal. Things like where the status is of the alternative proposal that the mayor's office is working on, those kinds of things. So I think before we sort of get into, I don't want to sort of shortchange information gathering where, I'm still learning a lot about this deal. Jerry reminded me of a few things in the deal tonight that I didn't know, and I appreciate you guys' patience with us because obviously you've been with this deal for a long time and we're still getting up to speed with it. So I'm going to take the action to send a list of things in that I think we're still missing in our information gathering stage, and then I plan to come to the next meeting with sort of questions out of that. But I think overall, to your overall point, I still think we need to spend some time understanding this before we can even begin to sort of think about what potential things the Fair Board might want to ask for here.
John.
Regarding the questions that have been submitted, we do have responses for those. Tom and I have been working on that, and so that should be going out to you soon. One thing we learned through the stadium process is that having written questions from the members is very helpful because instead of just giving our answer right off the cuff, we can be a little more deliberate about it. And so if any of you have questions and want to circulate them through Laura, we'd be happy to respond to those.
I think I appreciate that, John, and obviously that's exactly what Mario was saying. So we should also equip you with the information you need ahead of time to be able to answer. Are you guys answering those jointly as the two parties?
I prepared a draft of responses. I didn't have the information to respond to a couple of them, sent them to John. He sent them to his client, and he sent them back this evening. I hadn't had a chance to look at them.
Oh, and I wasn't complaining on them being late. I was just wondering about how you guys were kind of agreeing on what.
We're trying to do a collaborative job. We want to make sure we don't, if there are issues, we'll try to work them out and give you a joint response.
Thank you.
And the questions that we may have, are they available to the public to see the answers?
When we get the answers, they will be.
Okay.
Mario?
Commissioner Hartley reminded me of something, and as we heard public comments on both sides of the issue, or opportunity, we'll call it an opportunity. Laura, we discussed doing a tour for the Fair Board commissioners of the current Speedway. I think that's important. We're a new board. We haven't worked as a board previously, and so what I requested was that the Fair Board do a tour of the current facilities so that we get a better understanding. Some of us have been to events there, but I think a real insider view of what everyone involved sees on a day-to-day when there are events there will be helpful as we think about the alternative, right?
As long as it's north of 4 degrees, I'm okay with that. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Did you guys from Bristol want to add anything about what we just talked about? Okay. John, you got anything? Laura? Well, then I'd say we're done here. Thank you. Meeting is adjourned.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information on this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.